What's up, guys? Skyger's back. If you guys have watched my 4 Corpse Bride events video, I made a made-up character named Edward Vincent, who is a corpse groom and a love interest to Emily. The body I used for Edward Vincent was Edward Frankenstein from 2012 Frankenweenie. Edward is tall, he wears glasses, he has blonde hair, and he's very handsome. I explained a little bit of his backstory and a lot more of his Corpse Groom story. So I decided to bring back Edward Vincent to explain the full story about him, on how he lived and how he died. So let's get into the origin of Edward Vincent / the Corpse Groom. Edward Vincent was born in a wealthy family. His parents, named the Vincents, are a rich family. Edward grew up with a nice, lovely family. His father and his mother cheats Edward about the facts of life. After years of Edward growing up, he'll be 17 years old. But something terrible happened to Edward's parents. His father told Edward that him and his mother will be back shortly. The Vincents get on the buggy as they leave. While the Vincents are out on an evening stroll, the horse is being chased by a wild animal, whether if it's a bear or a wolf, whichever. The Vincents try to get away from the wild animal, but the chain that's attached to the horse breaks off. The horse runs away from the wild animal, but the Vincents weren't lucky. They were still on the buggy. They were about to jump off the buggy, but it was too late. The buggy falls off a cliff and crashes to the ground. The Vincents have died. The horse manages to return to the village. Edward sees the horse, but not his parents. The villagers and Edward went on a search to look for the Vincents. When they found their bodies, they were pronounced dead. After their funeral, Edward was mourning for the death of his parents. But Edward learned to stay strong after his parents teach him the facts of life. So he would take his parents' place and became a rich man. Edward didn't become a spoiled rich man, none of that. He uses his wealth to help the villagers. Edward grew up knowing that some of the villagers are living poor, so Edward wants to help them out by using his wealth, and all the villagers appreciate and thank Edward for his good and kind heart. When Edward was 18-19, he was also nice to kids and other good people. Edward would meet a few villagers in the past. Edward would meet Pastor Gosworth. Edward would come by to visit his church. Then he'll meet the town's crier, who Edward pays him for giving announcements. Then Edward would meet Hildegard. Hildegard says to Edward how she appreciates Edward's hard work for helping the villagers, and his parents will be proud of him. Edward thanks Hildegard for her kind words. She also likes Edward for being nice and kind to a lot of people. Then Edward will meet Mayhew. The two will be like good pals and good friends. They will also get a drink at a bar. Edward will also meet a few corpses that used to be alive that met Edward in the past. Edward would meet Alfred, who him and his wife Gertrude appreciate Edward as well. After Alfred's death, Edward arranged and paid for Alfred's funeral. He also wanted to make sure if Gertrude was okay. Gertrude says to Edward she'll be fine, and she thanks him for arranging Alfred's funeral. Edward once met the corpse that can split himself in half when he used to be alive. For this video, we'll just call him George. George was just another good friend to Edward. George will die a few months ago. Edward will hear about the Van Dorts, who are wealthy and sell fishes, so it looks like the Van Dorts have everything under control. He'll also hear about the Everglots and their wealth, but the Everglots barely come out of their house. Edward will meet his first ever love interest slash first girlfriend, and that was Emily when she was alive. Emily heard about Edward Vincent using his wealth and helping the people of England. She sees how Edward is a nice, good man. The two will get along with each other, and they'll become boyfriend and girlfriend. The two will become a couple. They will go on dates, talk about life, thinking about their future plans, and they will talk about how they want to become parents and have kids of their own. And they will also sing to each other as well. The two are a perfect couple. Then Edward will meet an old friend of his family. He will meet his father's friend, and that was Lord Barkis. When Edward was 10 years old, he met Lord Barkis. Lord Barkis was kind of like a relative to the Vincents. When he heard about the Vincents' deaths, he wanted to pay his respects for Edward. He tells Edward if he ever needs anything, he can talk to Lord Barkis. Edward would appreciate Lord Barkis. The two will become friends, sort of like Hector and Ineso from Coco, and Lord Barkis will become Edward's co-worker slash business partner. I will also have it be kind of like the first Iron Man movie. Let's say Edward is like Tony Stark, Emily is like Pepper Potts, and Lord Barkis is like Obadiah Stane. It'll be kind of like that. But, however, things will start to change. Lord Barkis comes by Edward's house, and he'll tell Edward something that sounds selfish to Edward. Lord Barkis says to Edward he should stop using his money to help the people of England. Lord Barkis says he should use his money for something else, or he could give all of his wealth to Lord Barkis. What do you say, Edward? Edward looks at Lord Barkis with disgust. He says to Lord Barkis, "I thought I trusted you, Barkis." "Well, somebody needs some cash, Edward. Your money will do." The two will argue. Then Edward will have enough. He tells Lord Barkis to get out and leave and never come back. And one other thing, stay away from Emily. Lord Barkis walks towards Edward's front door. But before he leaves, Lord Barkis foreshadows Edward's death. He says to Edward, "If you fall off a cliff, you break your bones and your neck." He gives Edward a menacing grin, but Edward shows no fear against Lord Barkis. Then Edward foreshadows Lord Barkis' death by telling him, "If you drink poison down your throat, you wouldn't even notice." The two will stare at each other. Lord Barkis says nothing else and slams the door. Lord Barkis is no longer Edward's business partner. After Lord Barkis left, things will change between Edward and Emily. Emily says to Edward she wants to move on with her life, but her parents told her no, and she wasn't ready yet. She didn't want to wait. She tells Edward she wants to go to a different place. She wants Edward to come with her too. But however, Edward said calmly, "Emily, I can't do that." He says he has a responsibility to help the villagers. He can't abandon these people. Emily says to Edward that he's given everything to these people. Don't you think it's time to move on from it? Edward says he'll want to move on, but however, the role keeps on changing. Edward says he wants his legacy to keep on helping people and keep on being nice and kind to others. Edward says to Emily he wants her to stay in England, but Emily doesn't want to stay. She wants to go to a different place, and if Edward won't come, then it's over for them. Edward thinks about it, but he still can't. He tells Emily, "I'm sorry." Emily, in tears, says, "Very well. Goodbye, Edward." She leaves Edward's house, walking away, sobbing. Edward was about to go out and talk to her, but he didn't know what to say to her. Edward sighs to himself as he's heartbroken. After 2 months has passed, Edward hasn't heard from Emily for quite a while. He decides to visit Emily's parents' house. Emily's father says to Edward that Emily left her parents' house 2 months ago. Emily's mother says to Edward that Emily took her mother's wedding dress and took a few jewels and money when she left and never came back. Edward says that Emily was at his house and broke up with Edward and left his house. Emily's parents are worried for Emily. They think something terrible happened to her. Edward says to Emily's parents he'll have the villagers and himself search for Emily. After a few days of searching, there was no luck. Emily was never found. Emily's parents are sad and heartbroken. They both assume that Emily ran away with the money and wedding dress and will never return. Edward is sad too. Emily's parents thank Edward for his hard work to search for Emily. Edward nods his head and says to Emily's parents, "Take care of yourselves." Edward goes home. He's so saddened about Emily. He figured that Emily must have moved on. Maybe she must have found someone else. Edward decides to move on too. But the real truth, what happened to Emily, she was killed by Lord Barkis. He sold her jewels and money and left her for dead. The villagers, Emily's parents, and Edward do not know about this. Then Edward will hear reports about young women being murdered in the streets, and their jewels and money are getting stolen. Edward realizes these women are being murdered in cold blood, and there's a serial killer in England. Edward keeps thinking in his head, maybe it could be Lord Barkis killing these women, but he doesn't know if he's right or wrong about that. But he has a sick feeling in his gut that maybe it could be Lord Barkis. Edward will give out a curfew to the villagers and the young women so that they will be safe. After 1 year, the curfew was over, and the villagers and the young women are safe. Emily's parents will die half a year ago. Edward Vincent will be 25 years old. In my version, Edward will be older than Emily, Victor, and Victoria. Edward would fall in love with a new, young woman, and after a few months of dating, they'll be engaged to be married in 3 days. Edward has to do one thing first. He needs to practice his vows. He will lock his wealth in a safe and heads out his house, locking his door. Edward will walk to the woods at night all alone. He will go deeper, deeper, and deeper into the woods. Edward will stand by a cliff and start to say his vows. After saying, "With this ring, I ask you to be mine," he raises the ring in the air. When he's finished with his vows, Edward is prepared and ready for his wedding. But on this night, Edward's fate would happen now. While he's holding the ring in the air, a thunder strikes down. This startles Edward as he starts to stumble and fall off the cliff. Edward crashes, breaking his bones and his neck. He falls to the ground. He's not moving. He's not breathing. Edward Vincent is dead. The night skies begin to rain as the mud buries his entire body, leaving his left hand out in the air. However, not only that Edward died, he also made the same vows Emily did, but it's the opposite. If any woman would perfectly say a vow, that woman will become Edward's bride. The next day, the villagers notice that Edward hasn't came out of his house. On the 4th day, Edward still hasn't came out of his house. They try to open his door, but it's locked. They break down the door. They don't see Edward in his house. They search every single room. He wasn't anywhere inside his house. The villagers went on a search for Edward. After looking everywhere, including the woods, Edward has been found. He disappeared the same way Emily disappeared. Edward's disappearance remains a mystery. Some of the villagers think that Edward abandoned them. but some do not think so, because all of them know that Edward is a good man. If he abandoned them, he would have taken all of his wealth. Since Edward has disappeared, they all honor Edward for a good, kind, and nice young man he was. And the woman that was supposed to marry Edward had married a different man. After a few years has passed, we will meet Victor and Victoria. The two will be engaged to be married. After Victor messes up his vows, he runs away from the Everglots' house. Victoria decides to go find Victor and comfort him. She goes off to find him, but she couldn't find Victor. She goes deeper, deeper, and deeper into the woods, but still couldn't find him. Victoria heads to the place where Edward Vincent died. She will sit on a log. She's exhausted from trying to find Victor. Victoria holds the second ring. She decides to say her vows. The scene goes to Victor as he starts saying his vows. It will go scene by scene with Victor and Victoria saying their vows. Victor awakens Emily, and Victoria awakens Edward Vincent, who is now a Corpse Groom. Edward says to Victoria, "I do." He takes Victoria to Land of the Dead. Victoria is confused and terrified. She asks, "Who are you and where am I?" He explains to Victoria his name is Edward Vincent, and he died by falling off a cliff. He made a vow to himself, and Victoria is his bride/wife. Victoria will remember the name Edward Vincent. When she was a teen, the villagers will talk about Edward Vincent. She also read stories about Edward, how he was a nice young man who uses his wealth to help the people of England. Victoria says to Edward how he was a good man helping a lot of good people back then, and saw a picture of Edward Vincent on one of his stories. She says to Edward how he looked very handsome back then. Edward smiles at Victoria and says he's flattered. He also tells Victoria that they're in Land of the Dead, where people die and arrive here as corpses. The two will hear a song playing. They head to see corpses singing Remains of the Day. After the song is over, Edward and Victoria will run up to Emily and Victor. At first, Victor and Victoria are surprised and happy to see each other, but Emily and Edward are shocked to see each other. "Emily? Edward? Oh my gosh, it's been a long time. I didn't know you were in Land of the Dead." "Actually, my spirit was in Land of the Dead. I was waiting for my true love to arrive at my grave, and he came, and he's my husband." Victoria says, "Husband?" Edward says to Emily that his spirit was also in Land of the Dead, and he waited for his true love as well. "Victoria came, and she's my wife." Victor says, "Wife?" Emily and Edward explain to Victor and Victoria that they used to know each other back when they were alive, dating, singing, and the night they broke up. Now they finally meet again in Land of the Dead, both as corpses. Victor talks to Edward and says he knows about him too, reading books when he was a teen. While Emily and Victor are doing their thing, Edward and Victoria get to know each other and get along with each other. Victoria says to Edward how she likes to help people too. If someone is sad or depressed, Victoria will come to them and make them feel better, and saying to them not to give up on themselves and to be the best person they want to be. Edward says, "That's great of you." He's glad that a lovely woman like Victoria cares and has a heart and follows the sign of good. Victoria does tell Edward that the vows that she said was a misunderstanding and she was supposed to marry Victor. Edward says, "Victor, the man that was with Emily?" Victoria says, "Yes, and it was according to plan." Edward says to Victoria when he died, if any woman says a vow, the woman becomes his wife. but he didn't know that Victoria was supposed to marry Victor. He thinks to himself if he's stealing Victor's marriage to Victoria, but the thing is, Emily is married to Victor, but is that what Emily thinks? In Land of the Dead, Edward would meet familiar corpses: Alfred, George, Hildegard, and Mayhew. Edward is happy to see them again. Edward also gives a wedding present to Victoria. She opens her present to reveal, ladies and gentlemen, Victoria's long-lost cat, Mrs. Fimmons. Edward and Victoria meet with Emily and Victor. Edward asks Emily if they can talk. Emily thinks about it and says, "Why not?" Edward and Emily have their talk, leaving Victor and Victoria to be with each other and talk too. Well, Edward and Emily are taking a stroll in Land of the Dead. They both explained how they both died. Edward says to Emily he died while saying his vows and the thunder made him fall off a cliff. When Edward first arrived in Land of the Dead, he expected to see his dead parents, but they're not here. Emily expected to see her parents too, but they're not here either. Emily says to Edward when she died, she took her mother's wedding dress and took half of the jewels and money. Edward says, "I know, your parents told me that when you disappeared." She said she waited by an oak tree, but everything went black. The next thing she remembered, she was on the ground. Her jewels and money were gone, and she was left for dead. Emily doesn't remember who killed her. She lost part of her memory of the person she was waiting for and killed her for dead. And not only all that, her dreams were taken away. Edward says, "That's terrible. I'm sorry that happened to you, Emily." Emily says that everything was going so well until the person, whoever it was, took it all away from her. Edward says to Emily that back then, him and the villagers went searching for Emily, but they couldn't find you. Emily asks Edward what happened to her parents. Edward says her parents moved to a different place and moved on, but they were still heartbroken for Emily's disappearance. The two talk for a while, but their conversation turns into an argument. Emily says to Edward he could have come with her and moved on, but Edward chose to keep on helping people. Edward says to Emily he couldn't give up on what he wanted to do was right. But when he died, he failed the villagers. Without Edward, he couldn't help them. Emily says to Edward, "It's not about helping, it's about you. You show the villagers how good you are, protecting them and giving them peace. When you died, maybe the villagers moved on and probably helped themselves without your help. It's you that wants to keep on going. You did your job helping a lot. Now it's time they help themselves too." Edward takes a moment and starts to realize that Emily is right. Emily says, "Maybe it's time to move on, Edward, but if you don't want to, then it's fine with you." Emily walks off, leaving Edward alone. Edward still realizes Emily is right about all of it. Maybe the villagers have moved on and helped themselves, and Edward wants to keep on going, but he's a corpse, and all the other corpses don't need help. They're fine the way they are, and they're happy too. Edward should do what all the corpses are doing: move on. Edward would sing a song to himself. After his song, Edward would find Emily talking to Victor and Victoria, along with Scraps and Miss Fimmons. Edward would say to Emily that she's right about him. She was right about all of it. He even said to her on the night they broke up, he was about to go outside to say something to her, but he couldn't find his words. Well, now he found his words. He said to Emily he's sorry that he couldn't go with her. He's sorry for her dreams being stolen. He still loved Emily when they broke up. Since he's a corpse groom, he wants to move on and go with Emily. He wants to be with Emily. Emily is surprised to hear all these lovely words from Edward. Edward would thank Victoria for freeing him out of his grave. Now, he'll do the same for Victoria. He gives the ring back to Victoria so she can be with Victor and marry him. Edward will pull out a different ring out of his coat. It's an old, dusty ring. This ring is the ring that Edward used to say his vows by the cliff where he died. He gets on one knee and proposes to Emily. He says, "Emily, will you marry me?" Victor and Victoria are surprised, and the corpses all gasp. Emily is filled with happiness as a tear slides down her eye. She gives the ring back to Victor so he can marry Victoria. She turns to look at Edward and says, "I do." Edward and Emily both hug. Victor, Victoria, and the corpses clap and cheer for Edward and Emily. We will go back to Land of the Living. The corpses arrive and get along with the living. A few other villagers are afraid and scared of the corpses until they meet Edward Vincent as a corpse. The villagers are shocked to see Edward Vincent after a few years. Edward explains to the villagers how he died, and he's proud that they helped themselves to survive, keep on going, and keep living. One villager says to Edward he thought they abandoned them. Edward says he will never abandon the villagers. He did a great job helping and protecting the villagers. Now they've done the same for themselves. All the villagers smiled at Edward. Edward also says they're all invited to a double wedding, and they'll be heading to Pastor Gosworth's church. The villagers follow the living and dead to the church. Victor, Victoria, Emily, and Edward all have a double wedding. Victor and Victoria are married, and Edward and Emily say their vows and are married. The two are happy to be back together, but that is until Lord Barkis enters, interrupting the wedding. Edward will instantly recognize Lord Barkis and whispers to himself, "Barkis." As Lord Barkis walks in front of the stage, he sees two familiar faces. At first, he's shocked to see Emily, but when he sees Edward, he's even more shocked. Lord Barkis says, "Edward? Barkis? What the hell happened to you? What happened to me? My question is, what are you doing here?" Lord Barkis says he came here because he heard about a wedding, but he didn't expect to see Edward and Emily. Then Emily looks at Lord Barkis as she starts regaining memory, and after a few seconds, she finally remembers. She says Edward's name. Edward looks at Emily. Emily says to Edward she remembers who killed her. It was Lord Barkis that killed her, stole the jewels, and left her for dead, and took her dreams away. Edward will look at Lord Barkis with disgust and anger. He yells out, "Damn you!" to Lord Barkis. Edward remembered back when he was alive, he had a gut feeling that it was Lord Barkis killing the young women, and he was right the whole time. Then Emily says there's also one thing Barkis took from her, and Edward should know about this. Edward listens to Emily. Emily says on the night they broke up, she went home in tears, but She started to feel a little sick. She went into the bathroom and vomited on the toilet. Then she felt something moving in her stomach. Edward says, "Wait, something moving?" Emily says to Edward she was pregnant. The living and dead all gasp. Victor and Victoria gasp too. Edward is shocked. He didn't know Emily was pregnant. Emily was planning to tell Edward, but that's when Lord Barkis came to her and told her to meet him by an oak tree. Lord Barkis then just took her dreams. He took their unborn child. Lord Barkis says he didn't know Emily was pregnant. Victor says to Lord Barkis, "You're a madman." Victoria says to Lord Barkis, "You're a monster." Edward still looks at Lord Barkis with anger. He didn't know he was almost about to become a father. Lord Barkis killed both Emily and his unborn child. The corpses are about to hurt Lord Barkis, but Lord Barkis grabs Victoria and a sword. He yells out to the corpses, "Back off." Lord Barkis just learned that Victoria's parents have no money, so he'll just take Victoria instead. He will not leave empty-handed. Victor tells Lord Barkis, "Take your hands off my wife." Lord Barkis points a sword at Victor and says, "Guess I'm gonna have to kill you too." He raises the sword in the air as he's about to kill Victor, but Edward grabs under his sword. As Lord Barkis is about to kill Victor, Edward uses his sword to stop the blade, saving Victor's life. They see Edward holding a sword. He tells Lord Barkis, "You heard him. Take your hands off his wife." Edward Vincent fights Lord Barkis in a sword battle. Edward will gain the upper hand on Lord Barkis, since he died at the age of 25. Edward points the sword at Lord Barkis. He says he will kill him for killing the young women, for killing Emily, and for killing his unborn child. Lord Barkis is terrified of Edward, but Edward lowers his sword down and says, "But I'm not a murderer like you." He tells Lord Barkis to get out and never come back here ever again. But Lord Barkis shouts, "No!" He uses his sword to cut Edward's left skeleton arm off that was holding the sword. He kicks Edward to the ground and points the sword at Edward. Lord Barkis yells, saying he will not take orders from a corpse, and he'll slice off Edward's head. Edward shows no fear and says to Lord Barkis, "Then do it." As Lord Barkis is about to slice off Edward's head, Emily steps in and takes the sword through her chest, saving Edward. She grabs the sword and points it at Lord Barkis and tells him to get out. She helps up Edward. Lord Barkis laughs as he grabs the poison cup. He says, "A toast to Emily and Edward. Always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Tell me, my dear, can a heart still break once it's stopped beating?" Edward gets mad and is about to hurt Lord Barkis, but Emily stops him. She nods her head in a sign of no. Edward understands her. The corpses are about to attack Lord Barkis, but Eldergunnick stops them. He says, "We are amongst the living." Then Lord Barkis says to Edward, "And Edward Vincent, you've been a good, nice young man, but you'll always still remain a dead corpse groom." Edward would stare at Lord Barkis and said one last thing to him, "Go to hell, Barkis." Lord Barkis drinks the poison and dies. The corpses take him to land of the dead. Lord Barkis is gone. Emily grabs Edward's left skeleton arm and puts it back on Edward. They both smile. Victoria thanks Edward for saving Victor. Edward says he's happy to do so. He tells Victoria to keep on helping people. Victoria says she will. They all say goodbye to everyone. Edward and Emily said to Victoria and Victor to take care of themselves. They both walk out the church as they both turn into blue butterflies flying to the sky. We go to heaven as we see Edward and Emily not as corpses. They are both back to normal. We see their parents in heaven. Emily's parents and Edward's parents, the Vincents. They're all happy to be reunited. Then Edward and Emily see the Vincents are holding something small. The Vincents give it to Edward and Emily. Edward uncovers the small blanket. They see a baby boy. The four parents said this is their baby. They've been taking care of him and they waited for Edward and Emily to meet him. They both look at their son. Emily, in tears and happy, says, "He's perfect." Edward, in tears and happy, says, "He's adorable." Emily says, "What should we name him?" Edward thinks for a second and finds a name. He says, "Peter. Peter Vincent." Emily smiles and says, "It's perfect." Peter Vincent opens his eyes and sees his parents. Peter smiles. Edward and Emily smile too. Emily's parents and Edward's parents are all happy. Edward and Emily are happy too. They are now father and mother. The family are all happy and in peace.